Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for watching the wonderful film Nefertiti's Daughter. My name's Sophie Kruz, and I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I'm here today with the director of Nefertiti's Daughters, which is Nickolas. Hi, Mark.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Great to have you. Mark is a longtime veteran of US politics, most notably as an aide to then Vice President Al Gore, and later managed federal and statewide campaigns before shifting his efforts to the political media world and eventually to filmmaking. So I would love to get started and find out how you made that shift from a very important career in politics to getting into documentary film.
Well, I did. I spent a long time in politics, and frankly, I just got to the point where I was ready to move on. Just sort of politics just drove me crazy. I was sort of fed up with it all, and my interest was really on the press and communication side. That was where I got my start before I started managing races, and ended up doing a lot of political media writing for publications, and decided later on in life, I was in my early 40s, to consider going back to school, and attended the New School in New York City, got my master's in media studies in film there, and decided that I wanted to continue sort of the work, the interest that I have in the political sphere, but, you know, maybe moving the focus a little bit to film. And I figured, you know, that would be an interesting thing. I didn't want to pick up a camera and just learn on my own. So I actually did go back to school full time for 2.5 years. And that was how I ended up here. Fast forward for a second, after the 2016 election, I did get sucked back into politics, and right now I am wrapping up. I'm managing a U.S. Senate race in Kentucky against Mitch McConnell. So back in it pretty deep right now. I'm looking forward to getting back into film again once the November elections are done with, though.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about how you got interested in this particular film, you know, with the revolution, and then of course talking about graffiti art and street art and how that was how it played a role in the revolution.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think back to the Egyptian revolution back in 2011. I along with so many others were just sort of captivated by what we were watching in Cairo, the uprisings, you know, in the whole region, but particularly Cairo, given our relationship with Egypt over the years. And, you know, Mubarak seemed like a guy who was never going to leave office in any easy way. And I think that what really fascinated me in watching what was going on in Cairo was when I started to notice the prominence of, you know, this street art and this sort of politically targeted graffiti throughout it, as though it became part of the dialogue of this revolution. And I was really captivated by it because, again, with my background in politics, really initially coming out of the communication side of that, you know, if you're in the communication side of politics, you know, you eat and sleep and breathe thinking, how do I most effectively communicate message to the public? Mm-hmm. And so to me, this was like the most remarkable, rawest form of political communication. Just, you know, ink, paint on a wall. And I think that's what drew me to the subject matter initially. Mm-hmm. And I thought, you know, that would be an interesting thing to explore, is sort of this as a communications device. And I think that, you know, my interest, just my personal interest in film, has always been, I love stories where you begin as a viewer believing that you know something about a subject, and then as you go down this journey, you just realize, my God, I had no idea, you know, about this. Mm-hmm. And so I thought that would be interesting to take a look at something, you know, familiar, the revolution, but sort of look at it from a different angle, you know, look at it from the perspective of, you know, the art, and how the art became part of the dialogue, part of the rallying, part of the way that the community understood what was happening. Mm-hmm. And it was only sort of during that exploration of doing a story like that that I started to dig a little under the surface a little bit more. And that was when I stumbled upon this much more interesting and remarkable story of these women. And I think that was what, that was sort of that was the hook. I mean, Bahia Shahab, I watched a TED Talk that she did, months before I'd left for Egypt. And I thought, that's amazing. Like that's the story. It's the story about the women. It's sort of this intersection of women, art, and revolution that I thought was, it was sort of I thought it was the more important story.
Yeah. Well, she's a wonderful character. And I love that you started with her 1,000 ways to say no. And this idea that she was this historian or this anthropologist who was documenting things at first as they unfolded, and then her journey through the film as she realizes that she actually wanted to be an active participant. I really loved the way you told her story and the way she sort of framed her own work in that way. So how did you come to meet her? How were you introduced to her work? It was through a TED Talk?
Well, yeah, I mean, I had become, I had noticed as I was, I guess, researching or watching this thing unfold and getting a better understanding of the street art and the graffiti that was happening there. I mean, I think context-wise, Cairo or Egypt wasn't a place where you had this sort of culture of street art. It didn't exist. Mubarak, there were no, you didn't grow up as a kid tagging walls in Cairo. I mean, Mubarak had that place in lockdown. So the artists that came out weren't what you would think growing up in a big city. I grew up in Oakland, California. I was, used to graffiti on walls, that wasn't what existed there. I mean, what existed, there was no real culture of it. And so what ended up happening during the revolution, the aftermath of the revolution, is you had these, almost all of them were professional artists of some, they were either graphic designers or, commercial artists or art historians, or, I mean, you had this level of talent that decided that they were going to engage by going out there and using their skills. So it was this, Amar in the film. I mean, Amar taught at, he was a university professor at Luxor. Like all of them, I think only Nazir was the only one who had no formal training. And so that was the interesting thing. It's one, and probably why it was so effective is that you have professional artists who who know how to distill complexity into something that the masses can understand, especially a country like Egypt that deals with a lot of, you have a lot of issues like illiteracy. So a lot of times the art had to be in images, not text, but these artists also were smart enough to know that they were not only communicating to the Egyptian public, but to all of us. And so a lot of the art is in English because they know that their audience isn't just those that are in Cairo. And so that was, and as you examined the art and these artists became pretty prominent and pretty well known. I was sort of shocked, I was shocked by the number of female artists that were prominent coming out of Egypt. And that shocked me in so many ways. You've got the fact that it was coming out of Egypt of all places, and street art sort of as a activity is, no matter where you look, it's overwhelmingly a sort of male dominated activity. Mm-hmm. And to see that the most prominent artists coming out of the revolution in Egypt were as likely to be women than men, really caught me. And that was as I did more research and I'd heard about Bahia. Mm-hmm. And then I stumbled upon her TED Talk and I thought, wow, I mean, she's remarkable. And anybody watching this after should just type in Bahia Shahab TED Talk and watch it. Mm-hmm. It's just tears came to my eyes watching this. And that was sort of when I thought, you know what, maybe that's the direction I need to go. Now, keep in mind, I did a Kickstarter to fund this, and I had a crew, and and it was sort of during the Kickstarter campaign that the shift starts to happen from sort of the graffiti to the women. And I mean, I only have a couple of months before we're expected to leave. And, you know, I mean, it was, you know, I just started to email her and Mira and others to see if they were interested. And, you know, there was a lot of reticence because by the time I arrived, the situation on the ground had really started to change. The military had taken control again. There was no more of this flourishing street art.
Talk to me a little bit about the timeline. The revolution was in 2011, and then you had this idea percolating.
So the revolution of 2011, right? And so the revolution happens in 2011, but so much. So you have sort of the main revolution that were these days in Tahrir Square in early 2011, but really so much of the aftermath of the revolution happened in the following year, which is that transition once Mubarak's gone to what they thought was going to be a more open society. And, you know, SCAF, the military, this military committee was running the show and doing a real poor job. And that was when it started to really boil over. And so, and eventually there was a transition from SCAF to elections. And then I believe it was, you know, a year later, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood was the one entity that was organized. So when they went from, you know, military rule to elections, usually that benefits those that are organized. And they were organized because this was a leaderless revolution. And so in mid 2013, after Morsi was president for a while, he was overthrown in a military coup. And so that was, so it was really a few months later that year of 2013 that this was of interest to me. And, you know, it was folks on the ground liked the idea who I talked to about it, but everybody warned me, like, be careful. Like, this is a volatile time. And a friend of mine was a correspondent for CNN and had worked in the Cairo bureau for a time. And he had put me in touch with his producer who was still there. And I talked to her about this. And she said that if I was going to do this, that I should not under any circumstance do it without a very prominent fixer who can help me navigate on the ground. And she said that CNN and BBC only used one guy in Egypt. And so she made the introduction.
Maybe for folks who don't know the term fixer, what does a fixer do?
Yeah. Well, fixer is sort of the guy, or the person on the ground who's from there, who knows how to navigate everything from, you know, getting credentials, movements, security, helping you with, to help advance, you know, people you might interview. They're the sort of on the ground producer type, but he was a former military guy. And so he had connections. And so he knew how to, you know, he knew how to grease the wheels. He knew how to deal with the bureaucracy and to do it in a way that hopefully wouldn't get us arrested. And so I reached out to him, and he was interested in the story and agreed to do it. His name was Rami Francis. And so I'd never worked with a fixer before, especially a fixer in a place like Cairo. But CNN and said, you know, don't do it unless you can get him, because you'll probably get arrested if you're here. And so that was sort of the first step. And it was, everything sort of happened in motion. I mean, this was like my first major film project coming out of school. And so you're learning a lot on the fly. Unfortunately, you're also learning it on the fly in a, you know, in a fairly volatile, somewhat dangerous environment. In fact, I had worked for, in politics, a U.S. Senator about a decade earlier who was at the time the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. And I remember reaching out to him saying, I'm going to Egypt. Can you help make sure that, I've, been in touch with the embassy, and that, I'm doing this right, and that you're my point of contact if I get arrested. And they really helped. And the embassy was, excited I was doing this, nervous I was doing this, wanted to make sure that they knew where I was at every moment while I was there.
Yeah.
And I don't think I maybe appreciated that aspect of it until I was on the ground. And on day one, we were arrested. And thankfully,
Oh, wow.
I had, and for doing nothing improper. But in Egypt, anything at any moment that they deemed could be improper, And so we were detained for several hours. And thankfully, on day one, I didn't have to pick up the phone and call Senator Johnston and say, hey, in trouble. We got out of that, but it was a wake-up call. So it was tough. But I didn't have all the interviews ready to go. Bahia was out of town until my last 2 days in Cairo. And so, you're winging it. And I feel very fortunate that it all, came together the way it did.
So were you, traditionally you'd get like film permits or permission from the government to be able to shoot in a foreign country or import the film equipment. Were you doing things on the books, or were you, going the run and gun way? Yeah, you were on the books.
Not in Egypt. No. We absolutely did it as formally as possible. Applied for credentials from the government. And, I remember Ramey helping me through this, right? Because they wanted a synopsis of what the film was going to be. And he said, if you write to them and say you're doing a film about revolutionary street art, they're going to deny you the permit. I said, well, I'm not comfortable straight up lying about this, because all you have to do is Google my name and this project, and you're going to see my Kickstarter campaign, which is clearly all about revolutionary street art. And, Ramey's first comment is, no one in Egypt's going to Google anything. That's not the way they work. So, but I said, the idea of something going wrong and I had lied to the government just made me a little nervous about this. And so in the end, I wrote the synopsis of the project that I remember it was, I'm working on a project about Egyptian culture and art that will include interviewing, this and this and this. I think I buried the word artist or, street artist in the middle of it. Mm-hmm. They approved it. So upon arrival, we went to whatever the ministry was, got our, formal credentials, which really were like handwritten things that were stapled together that you would think was done in a junior high school, not in not at the highest level of government of a country of 100 million people. Yeah. But that was just the way it was. And so, and also you just quickly realize that just because the government ministry gives you credentials doesn't mean that the policeman on the street cares about your credentials. Yeah. And so there was always this cat and mouse, which is, the government the ministry would give you, they would assign sort of like a press person to be with you when you're shooting outside. It wasn't a censorship issue. He didn't care about that. It was just, he had his little folder with credentials, and anytime you're outside, Tahrir Square, wherever, and you jump out with the camera, literally within a minute, you would be descended upon by police, uniformed or not uniformed. Mm-hmm. And then it would be incumbent on the guy from the ministry to deal with them. And invariably, this is the naive American in me, it was an exchange of money. And often it was an exchange of money from the ministry official to the policeman. Just sort of just trying to navigate it, but the police don't care what the ministry's papers say. And so really what you're doing when you're not shooting inside, if you're outside shooting anything, B-roll, you've got a minute or two to shoot before the screaming and yelling starts. And usually it just ends with you getting back in the car. So usually you just have to just shoot as much as you can, because you're going to get shut down, and hopefully you have enough to get back in the car. And so all the B-roll we shot, everything that's in the film is really, you did these little moments that you're shooting. So it was an eye opener. But we did it formally. We needed to get documentation and bring film equipment in and out because Egypt doesn't subscribe to the same customs standards that most countries do as far as getting film equipment in and out. For them, you have to declare what you're bringing in, and then when you leave, they have to go through it and make sure every piece of equipment that you brought in, you brought out, because but we did it formally.
Well, I want to go back to something you mentioned, that Bahia, you only had 2 days to film with her. That's amazing to me. You really were able to build such intimacy in that interview with her, especially when she's talking about or sort of reliving the blue bra incident and how that affected her. So how did you do that in 2 days? How did you build that intimacy?
Well, I don't know. I mean, she and I, we never talked before we met. We only exchanged some emails. I don't know how seriously she took the project. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, we had we seemed to have a good personal connection when we met at her studio. I don't know the answer to how we built that, other than I think our personalities were matched. I think she sized me up pretty quickly and tried to figure out what my angle, what my agenda was. And she allowed herself to open up. And, I did a lot of shutting up interviewing her. And this was one fear I had is, I'm not a woman. I'm not Egyptian. I'm not Muslim. I'm not a street artist. I'm an American. So, the world that, we look at the world very differently. And so I'd been very concerned about whether I was going to destroy this project and this would be another ethnographic disaster that future film students could watch and say, this is what you don't do, when you go to a foreign country, a foreign land. And so I really did my best to shut up and listen and not try to steer the film in a particular direction, because I really was interested in their story. And no, I mean, I was so fortunate to have not just somebody as remarkable as Bahia that trusted me, but that she allowed herself to be emotional, to relive it. And, I got really lucky that I got somebody like her to trust me, and I felt a real obligation to do this right. I mean, not that I wouldn't anyways, but there was a particular sense of, don't fuck this up. It was really that when I got back, like I felt like this was a little gift that I was given, and I needed to do this right for them, and for me. But I also felt like, this is an important story that's not being told. And in fact, when the film premiered at Aspen Shorts Fest in 2015, a year later, and it was one of their sort of anchor films, and they flew Bahia out from Egypt to be there for the premiere. So it was great to see her. First time I'd seen her since we filmed. Yeah. And we were in there getting ready for the screening, and I turned to her and I said, why did you trust me? Like, of all the people, like, why did you trust me to tell this? Because I mean, if I'm you, I don't have any of the boxes that I might want to check as a film, who you'd want to trust to tell the story. And her answer was, you were the only one that asked. And for them, what bothered them is that there were a lot of stories and films about the men. The male artists got a lot of attention. If you see the film, that the Academy Award-winning film, The Square, there's sort of this motif throughout the film of somebody painting outside. Well, that's Amar, who's in the film. Amar, Genzir, all the artists that came out of the revolution who were men just got so much attention.
Yeah.
And the women didn't get any. And so Bahia said, you were the only one that asked. And frankly, and when she said I don't know whether there were conversations with anybody else. It was like, we have to decide, like, do you wait for a filmmaker who maybe you have more reason to believe is going to understand the story, or do you take a chance so that it's told? And she decided to take a chance. And I got lucky. I got lucky that they took a chance because, I'm not the filmmaker, that you would go to if you're them and hope for, a film that sort of captures what you intended to do. And so,
And did she see the film for the first time at that festival, or had she seen it before then? What was her reaction to it when she saw it?
Well, so I wrapped shooting. We were in Cairo filming for a little less than 2 weeks. And that was in April of 2014. I come back to Brooklyn to edit the film. And by about June, July, the presidential election happens and the military general is now president. And the whole world in Egypt has changed now. I mean, everything is shut down. Anybody who is an oppositional figure, an artist, a journalist, an activist are just, they're prevented from doing anything. And I got nervous about the fact that did these artists say things to me in April that they wouldn't dare have said to at that time, knowing sort of what the situation on the ground was like. So I decided to share with all of them, the 6 of them, a rough cut of the film. And I said, don't tell me what you like and don't like about how you look or whatever. But like, is there anything that you've said that you worry is going to get you arrested, killed, whatever? And not one of them did. Not one of them asked for anything. And Bahia's response to me was, she just responded back with something real sweet, like, I cried when I watched it, thank you. And, that felt good, because it felt like you'd gotten it right. So it was the first time. So it was the first time she had seen it, other than like on a small screen. But it was more than a rough cut. But it was what, I didn't want to go too far with it if I knew there were problems. But it was hard for her to watch it in the theater. Like, she was a mess watching it, and she had to compose herself a little bit before we went on stage for the Q&A, because it was a packed opera house in Aspen, and they were pretty excited when she came on stage with me. But no, so.
Yeah. And what has been, when you went into making the film, did you have any plans for impact or social change or legislative change? And what has been the impact now that the film is out?
Yeah, well, I didn't go into it with any outcome other than trying to shine light on a story that I thought was important to tell, and I thought people would find interesting to receive, because this intersection of sort of, women, art, and revolution. I mean, they sort of, like, I look at it as sort of a triangle, like you get all three and they intersect at 3 points. There's a story of women in art and women in revolution and art and revolution. And for me, I wanted to contribute to what would be there for people down the road to when they want to learn about the revolution, not just the straight up, military, part of it, but the other parts of it. And for me, I've always been attracted as myself as I love stories about, like, the underdog, the person that sort of takes on the system. And I also love stories where you begin your engagement with it believing that you know something about this story, and then you leave it going, I had no idea. And to me, this seemed like exactly that story. Like, you start with some familiarity, Tahrir Square, Mubarak, yeah. And then suddenly there's art, women, revolution, and sort of learn something that I don't think is apparent up front. That was what I set out to do. And I wanted to make, and keep in mind, I mean, this was my first significant project coming out of graduate school. So for me, it's, beginning of your body of work. I had a short film before then that did really well, that I got really lucky, that really helps to catapult you to your next film and your next film. I was thrilled by the reaction to the film. There was a particular moment of satisfaction, was when in Kuwait, there's been an effort by a group of women, led by a group of women, who are trying to change the Constitution. That has to do with, some parity between the rights of a husband and the rights of a wife, and a lot of other things that are absurd. And they are trying to deal with, change in a country that is not all that, accepting of a lot of structural change like that. And they reached out to me because on International Women's Day, they were going to screen 4 films in downtown Kuwait in a public park that they had apparently gotten permission to do. And my film was one of the 4 they wanted to screen. And the idea that a film about, that they thought that the film, which actually talks about them, it's women that are from the region, wanted to share it among each other, I think made me feel like, I did good. I contributed to this. And I mean, the film is just, it's been humbling by the reaction. I had a distributor pick it up like right away. It's a 40-minute short, distributors don't, and a significant distributor picked it up, and they've been very aggressive. And it's the interest in universities and cultural institutions that have acquired it or wanted to screenings. I just got back from Berlin for a screening with groups out there, and I think that also because of how, I don't know, I don't want to call it a failed revolution, because I don't think it was a failed, but as bad as it is now in Egypt, I think that this snapshot in time it only existed then. It quickly ended again. And so it's nice to be able to contribute this snapshot that during this window, this was a world that existed, and hopefully we'll get there again. But it's far, it's much more repressive now than it was under Mubarak, sadly. So when you ask Bahia and others now,
let's talk a little bit about that. What are the women doing now? Are they still able to create art, or what is the environment like, and what are they hoping to kind of do moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, there's just nothing going on in the country art-wise. Public art just doesn't exist. Bahia is a university professor. So for her, the art was not, her vocation is not street artist. Her vocation is university professor. Mm-hmm. And so she was able, once she couldn't go on the street anymore, to return to her, to American University in Cairo and teach undergraduates. But she has managed to carve out a remarkable international career in art. She has become, watching her ascension on the scene internationally, especially in the last few years, has just been wonderful, because she's so fantastic, just so brilliant, and the recognition she's getting is just tremendous. And I've been invited to attend so many remarkable things, even for someone who spent a career in politics and usually doesn't get too, awed by spectacle. She was awarded, she was one of the fellows for a notable award that's given annually, the Prince Claus Award in Netherlands, that's given to, it's like cultural artists, that's given by the royal family in the Netherlands. And for the event, they invited Bahia to the royal palace for a ceremony and dinner with the royal family. And I got invited to attend and things like this. And you're just so happy for her, that she's getting this. Sadly, there's this dual thing. she can't do her work in the country. She only do her work outside the country. And she has to hope that those of us who don't live in Egypt are doing something to help this, to help the memory of this and to help propel it. It's tough. The other artists, Mira's a yoga instructor. She had a background in art and went out and did that. And once they cracked down on the artist, she went back to her yoga studio. All the artists aren't, they can't do anything. And Amar's the only one who's still pretty prominent, but can't do anything political. What's interesting though about the story is, so Shahira Amin, the journalist that's in the project, in the film, I used her in a supporting role, which always was disappointing because she is such a prominent media figure, or at least was in Egypt. She was sort of the senior anchor of state TV who walked out during the revolution and went down into Tahrir Square, a level of courage that is just impossible for me to really capture, that act. Like, if the revolution doesn't turn out exactly the way it does, she's imprisoned or executed or whatever, right? She was able to return to journalism after the revolution. But once Sisi became president, they very, very aggressively cracked down on her. They put her on trial for being a threat to national security for her reporting, and for her, it's a different ballgame because her career is journalism. For Bahia and for a lot of the others, it's not their career, and so they can somewhat safely retreat back to sort of what they did for a living. For Shahira, on the journalism side, it's become impossible. And so we've remained in touch. But yeah, I mean, I was fortunate in being able to capture a moment in time that quickly vanished. And I don't even know whether I would be allowed back in the country. I don't know. I don't know that I'm going to test it. But yeah, it's a different world. So the art doesn't exist. Anything oppositional right now in Egypt doesn't exist. If you're an activist, you're either in prison or you've been exiled or silenced. If you're a journalist, you write the pro-Sisi pieces. If you're an artist, you're doing things that are cultural that have no political component to it.
So it sounds like the story definitely is continued after you finished filming. What's next for you? Are you planning to keep following the story or moving on to other projects?
Well, I had always intended to move on to other projects. I thought, I'm not going to be one of those filmmakers that can't let go of a project. I'm going to do it and then move on to the next. But when Bahia came out to Aspen for the premiere, when we were talking that day, she was telling me like how bad things had gotten, and that Amar had been arrested earlier that week for doing something that was like not even political. Like, they were very aggressively cracking down, and she just seemed different. Like the year had taken a real toll on her. You could sense the weight of it all. Sort of the hopefulness that she had even in the film seemed to really be diminished. And she was just telling me just like how much things had changed and how bad it was. And about a month after the screening, she was headed to Germany, to Freiburg, Germany, because it was her first international solo exhibition. And they were going to screen the film. And she's like, why don't you come out for the screening? And I thought, maybe I should go out for the screening and just bring my film equipment and no crew and just maybe interview her and shoot. At least I'm going to have an opportunity to shoot her setting up for a week, her exhibition. Because in the film, by the way, I wanted to digress for a second or go back. The film has like almost no B-roll. And that was a horrifying development because I thought when we would get there that, we'd get to go out at night with the artists while they're doing their, their painting, and I'd get to shoot. And you arrive and they're like, we're not going out. And you think, so how do I tell this story? Now, I don't have any B-roll of them actually working, other than in Bahia's studio briefly. You've got a couple of shots in there. And so, you know, that was part of the challenge of actually constructing the film, is how do you tell a story of this thing when you only have interviews to work with and archival images. And so, you know, you have to improvise. So going to Germany, I got to actually spend a lot of time with her and shoot her while she's setting up. And coincidentally, Shahira Amin, the journalist, was going to be in Antwerp, not, you know, a drive away, Antwerp, Belgium, visiting her son who'd moved there. And she was then really, they were coming after her. So I said to Shahira, well, if I'm going to come out there for Bahia, can I come up and visit and interview you? And I did. And it was clear that everything had changed in a year. Like, everything had changed. Everything about the situation, the political environment, just the frame of mind, just their attitudes, just and so I thought, you know what, maybe I do need to continue shooting this. And so I have, you know, Bahia and I was just with Bahia in the last 12 months in London and in Antwerp, again, her in Antwerp, and in Berlin, and we did some more interviewing, and I'm sort of done. I'm ready to edit once the election is over, so I can get back to filmmaking. I think that, you know, you watch these women now trying to come to terms with a failed revolution and their place in it, and how do you move forward? How do you do this? And, you know, it's they're struggling, and yet especially Bahia, I think so many people have put their hopes in her and her work, and she clearly feels the heaviness of people's hope, you know, expectations, hopes in her. And I think she feels like she can't give up. Like, if she gives up, that's the blowing out of the candle, despite knowing that, you know, how difficult it's going to be. And Bahia's got 2 young daughters. This isn't someone who, you know, who can allow herself to be imprisoned or arrested. She's got to take care of a family. And so I think that also comes into play. And so I'm hoping by next spring, now we're living in a different world with what we're dealing with now with this pandemic. Hopefully shooting's done. I don't have to worry about the shooting. But I'm hoping that by next spring I'll have something that I can finalize and get that out there too. And so, and round 2, I guess.
Yeah, we'll definitely look forward to it. Her story is incredible, and it sounds like it's really continued in a powerful way. So we'll look out for that. And I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you so much for doing this and for making such a wonderful film. And I hope everyone enjoyed watching our talkback and watching the film, and keep in touch. Is there a way that they can find out more information if they want to?
Well, you know what? If people want to reach out, they should just feel free to email me. I'm mlnickolas@gmail.com. It's MLNICKOLAS. Feel free to reach out. Getting thrown back into the political world, I've had a pretty low profile these days. And as far as social media and all that, just strong encouragement to keep a low profile because of all the meddling by foreign actors, and they're targeting high-level races. So that's sort of the other part of it. But people should feel reach out, and but I'm hoping that next year there'll be, you know, I'll be able to put out something a little bit more about this amazing story. But thank you for having me, and I hope people enjoyed the film. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Thank you. Take care.
All right.